So thank you. So today's talk is about translanguaging, but I'm taking perhaps a slightly different perspective on translanguaging with the work that I'm presenting today. So the title of the talk is Translanguaging and Creative Arts, Conceptualizing Collaborative Creative Practice. And as Claudia has said, just a few things about me. I'm a senior lecturer in literacies and language at Sheffield University, which is in the UK, in South Yorkshire in the north of England. I also have a docentship in creative inquiry and applied linguistics at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. My PhD I got at the University of Leeds in West Yorkshire, which is actually where I'm presenting from today. So I'm presenting from West Yorkshire. This is probably only important if you're from Yorkshire, but it's good to know these details. So my PhD explored translation and translanguaging in production and performance in community arts, and I finished that at the University of Leeds. And I was very fortunate with that PhD because I was part of a bigger project that was led by Professor Angela Crease called Translation. It's got a very long name that I'm probably going to get the words in the wrong place, but translation and translanguaging in super diverse wards in 4 UK cities. So I was able with my PhD to be immediately part of this huge team of people who were looking at translanguaging across these different contexts, which was a really great, really generative experience for me. And since then, I've researched language and communication, but particularly in creative contexts. So for my PhD, I worked with street performers, and I worked with street performers who are based in West Yorkshire and also in Slovenia. And then since then, it's really diversified in terms of what I've been doing. I've worked a lot with visual artists. I've worked in community arts contexts and participatory arts. And I've worked with creative journaling, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. But something that holds all my work together is really my interest in creative practice and how people do things together, and in language as part of the kind of broader assemblage that within these contexts. So language is central to my work, but it's also decentered in the fact that I'm interested in the other things that happen around language. So in today's talk, I'm going to be looking at some work I've been doing over the last, adding up the years now, maybe so since the start of 2022. So that makes it 3.5 years nearly, which is all around journaling for mothers and birthing parents and creative journaling groups for people who identify as mothers and as kind of emerging at these intersections of arts and health. So I'm going to be telling you more about this work later in the presentation, but that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. I'm really interested in ideas of the everyday and the mundane, and I'm particularly intrigued by the way that we engage with the everyday in research. I think so often in research we focus on what might be extraordinary or different or exciting, and actually the everyday is something that has so much to bring us as researchers if we're interested in social life and we're interested in how people collaborate with each other and how people just kind of get on in their everyday lives, and in what you might think is mundane. So I'm interested in creative practice that foregrounds this everydayness and this mundane, which creative journaling, as I'll go on to talk about, does in different ways. So some key this is the structure of my talk. I'm hoping to keep it to 40 minutes, but I did say to Claudia that I haven't scripted it, so it's always slightly unknown how long I'm going to talk for. Some key concepts that I'll be talking about are translanguaging in terms of expansions, in terms of constrictions, also in terms of critiques. So, and this idea of the je transpersonnel, which I'm taking from the work of writer Ernaux, and I'm using that as a kind of conceptual, as a lens to think about the journaling practices that I'm investigating for my research. I'm going to talk about my research context in terms of arts and health, well-being, creative practice, and then about maternal journal and what that is and what that looks like, and what maternal journal how that evolves in particular places. I'll tell you about the methodologies and the different ways that I'm researching this practice, and then give you a sense of what kinds of data I have and some analysis of some artworks and some different ethnographic field notes and vignettes. To then kind of take that forward and think about what this means for our understandings of translanguaging. How useful is translanguaging when exploring this kind of context, and thinking about what this idea of the je transpersonnel and what that can bring us in terms of engaging with this work and with people doing work in this context, and of course with the participants in these practices. And I'm going to also give an indication of some of the future directions that this work can go in. And as I will say later on, I'm building at the moment. I'm looking at building something that is working across different countries, kind of looking at the work I've done so far with quite a big team in different ways, and thinking about what that is going to look like in the future. And I'm excited for your questions as well at the end. So just a note on some of the concepts. Now, I know that the seminar series is really focusing on translanguaging. So I think probably every talk is going to have some kind of conceptual framework relating to translanguaging. And I think what's really interesting about translanguaging, and this being a concept that I have engaged with through my research for the last 11 years since I started my PhD, and obviously seen it grown and seen it be dissected and seen it be developed in so many different ways and in so many different contexts. And I find what's really interesting about translanguaging is becoming less about what it does as a concept, less about what it might mean as a practice. I think it's quite embedded now in the way that we think about dynamic multilingualism. I think that we're very used to seeing the word translanguaging. We're very used to thinking about what that might mean, and we're also used to debates on translanguaging as well. But what is really interesting for me about translanguaging is how it's been taken up in so many different ways. So Lee Wei writes about translanguaging as really capturing people's imaginations. It's something that Dovchin and Lee have also talked about in their work in terms of this translanguaging's purposefulness. And perhaps one way of understanding its wide take-up is that it's the acknowledgement of the need to find ways to account for the dynamism and mobility of communication in an unpredictable world. So what's interesting about translanguaging and other ways of conceptualizing dynamic multilingualism, because obviously translanguaging is just one of many different ways that researchers have used and to explore our ways of communicating. What's interesting about it is the fact that it's become so popular, and because this speaks to the fact that there's a need to try and conceptualize what's happening when we communicate in a very unpredictable world. So in my own work, and again, this started very much with my PhD, which was exploring translanguaging in street theatre, is that when I talked about my work, when I talked about what I was doing for my research with different practitioners, I became very, very interested in the way that artists and other creative practitioners, performers, would take the idea of translanguaging as a concept and then kind of mold it and play with it in different ways through their practice. And I became interested in the fact that this idea from sociolinguistics was interesting to artists, and that it did different things for them in terms of perhaps having them think about their own interdisciplinary practice, for example, or how they might embed language in their work, or the language around the work and translanguaging around that language. So the idea of translanguaging as a kind of imaginary, I find very generative and really quite fascinating. But if we're going to start from we're going to have a point of departure, then obviously this is a very oft quoted way of conceptualizing translanguaging as being the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named and usually national and state languages, which is obviously a starting point. I have to just apologize for that. My lovely children have just come in from school, and they've actually brought me an ice cream, which is very sweet, but we're just putting that in the freezer. So that's a kind of point of departure. But again, like I say, I'm interested in why people are interested in translanguaging. So translanguaging has become a concept that's been extended, it's been stretched, it's been pushed to encompass multimodality. With colleagues James Simpson and Emily Moore, we've explored how it could be used to kind of conceptualize collaboration across different practices, so interdisciplinary collaborations. But this from Adrian Blackledge and Angela Crease is also, I think, a really generative way of thinking about it. And in their article, which is about translanguaging and the body, they talk about translanguaging as referring to communicative practices in which people engage as they bring into contact different biographies, histories, and linguistic backgrounds. They say translanguaging has the potential to be transformative and creative because it can transcend apparent difference. It can enable people to communicate with whatever resources are available to them rather than constraining them within prescribed limits. So predominantly a sociolinguistic concept, but in dialogue with theories of dynamic multilingualism, translanguaging's extension by scholars working in areas beyond much language-oriented research, which is focused on the classroom, has opened it up for new readings and new interpretations. And some of the work that I'm talking about today is part of a draft, a chapter that's been submitted for a handbook of translanguaging, and the chapter is all about translanguaging and art. So moving on to think about the arts and creativity. The arts offer myriad rich sites for much needed critical contemplation of both this expanded notion of communication, semiotic boundaries, and the ways in which wider histories, conversations, and complexities are brought into moments, which we might define as a critical point in time and space, which has been assigned significance by those involved or through analysis. And there's lots of different examples of translanguaging in and through art, including the ones within this seminar series. So translanguaging and art and creative practice could be seen as ideal companions because of this openness, because of this way of thinking about concepts that doing interdisciplinary work and creative work can bring us. So just a few examples. I know De Brockner-Futro is one of the speakers in this seminar series, but her work around co-productive projects, which involve creative practitioners as co-researchers, and the way that she's used translanguaging to explore what multilingual artists are doing is really innovative and really fascinating. Also translanguaging as a lens for exploring multilingual practices in the arts and as a conceptual starting point for multidisciplinary artistic practice. So an artist called Ella McCartney, I think she's London-based, who worked with Zhu Hua, and she's a visual, so Ella McCartney is a visual artist, and this piece also involved dance, and she was engaging with ideas of translanguaging and then creating art that responded to the conceptualization of translanguaging and dynamic multilingualism. So moving on to creativity, constraints, and mundanity. Obviously, there is still, even with this kind of expansion and kind of stretching and molding and doing all these things with this concept and all this excitement about this concept, the languaging part of translanguaging clearly is always going to be restrictive if we're going to keep coming back to this idea that actually the languaging suffix is there. So Pennycook talks about this and then the fact that actually we can do all kinds of things with it, but ultimately we are also restricted with the words. And Marco Santello has provided some really fascinating critique, working with ideas from Michel de Certeau, where he's saying the theorization of creativity as related to translanguaging is at an early stage. It's clear that translanguaging has couched creativity as boundary transcendence and as disruptive practice. And what he says, which is very relevant to the work I'm going to show you today, is that actually it's about inhabiting what is given rather than transcending it. And that's what's creative, this idea of inhabiting what's given. We're not always pushing the boundaries. We're not always transcending boundaries. Actually, quite often what people are doing is translanguaging to get by in the everyday, in the mundane. So he suggests that what we should be thinking about, rather than this kind of constant pushing of boundaries is that there are issues of control over circumstances and doing, the more general explicit acknowledgement of constraints and the potential non-disruptiveness that comes with creative multilingual practices. He's arguing that actually most people in their multilingual everyday are just doing things to get by. They're not necessarily constantly pushing at these boundaries. And this links back to this idea of the everyday, to the idea of the mundane, to the banal. And with Sari Pöyhönon, we published this year an article where we're trying to think about the mundane and the everyday and our different ways of approaching it and documenting it and kind of capturing it as researchers and some of the ethical dimensions of that. So I like this idea of inhabiting what is given, and also this desire that I mentioned to find ways to capture the everyday. And that brings us to the notion of the jeu transpersonnel. So many of you would have read potentially the work of Annie Ernaux. It's something that if you're in when I was growing up in the 1990s, I was doing my A-level French at college, and her book La Place was part of the curriculum. So this was my first introduction to her work. Now, the book Les Années, or The Years, is a collective autobiography. So she uses she and we to narrate the individual life in dialogue and entangled with social, historical, and cultural change in France from 1941 to 2006. And she uses this idea of the jeu transpersonnel, and the idea of this, so in The Years, is actually the I completely disappears. And she says, for me, the jeu is not an identity, but a place. It's marked by human experiences and by human events. And she says that that is what I try to illuminate through my writing. This is in an interview with Lauren Elkin for the White Review. She says, I say jeu transpersonnel because it's not the individual or the anecdotic that interests me, but that which is shared, whether that be social or even slightly in the order of the psychological, in the realm of reaction. So in this sense, the jeu transpersonnel or transpersonal I is an expansive means to acknowledge collective experience. Ernaux describes her use of the jeu transpersonnel as a jeu that's marked by the communal experiences which many of us have known. The position that the individual is always implicated in this collective, and of course vice versa, aligns to some extent with other ideas about that are trying to connect this and trying to kind of problematize this relationship between the individual and the collective, the community. And Lou Harvey and colleagues have written about this in terms of the transrational voice, thinking about this as both individually uttered and collectively produced. So we can't think of one without the other. So if I'm to bring this idea back to translanguaging, an individual repertoire is shaped by others. So if we go back to the citation from Blackledge and Crease, there are biographies, histories, and linguistic backgrounds, which are, in Ernaux's words, marked by human experiences and human events. And then this links to another writer who I'm very fond of, Elena Ferrante, who also is thinking about this, about who the I is and what we're writing. And she says, I've never stopped believing in the importance of the writing we've inherited, which the I who writes is made of. So thinking again of this idea of the biographies, histories, and linguistic backgrounds that we bring to all our interactions, but also the collective and the kind of interpersonal within that. So thinking about that which is shared. So I want to kind of move on now to the research context that I'm talking about today, and this is in terms of arts and health. So I've been doing this work for the last, as I said, 3.5 years, and I work with an arts organisation which is in West Yorkshire. It's actually in the city that I live in, and they are connected to different organizations and charities. They're an arts organization who have studios for artists and creative practitioners. They also have a very strong community program, so working with different communities, an outreach program. They have courses that you can pay for and come along to. They have a cafe space. They have a shop where they sell works by artists within the studios. They have an exhibition program. They have artists in residence. They have a studio, a sanctuary program for refugee communities as well. So they're very dynamic, very small, very dynamic organization that's engaged in kind of lots of different aspects of creativity within the city. And they have multiple ongoing projects which relate to creative health and well-being. So there's something of a hub within the city in the local area about creative health, about well-being, and their team brings together lots of different funding, so kind of drawing on diverse funding streams to carry on and kind of continue their commitment to working with the diverse communities in the city. And one of these projects, which is where I first started working with them, is called Re-emerge. And this happened over the last couple of years. It was actually funded by the NHS, so the National Health Service. It was funded by one of their strands of funding, which aimed to support the post-COVID landscape. So looking at what communities were facing in relation to arts and in relation to health and well-being after the pandemic, which obviously caused significant disruption and change to people's everyday lives. I should also mention that my relationship with this organisation goes back quite a long way. I worked when I was doing my PhD, I collaborated with an arts organisation who have studios within this particular arts organisation. And as you can imagine, with any kind of research with creative practitioners and in creative context, things are very interconnected. Something I've become interested in with my work as well is how organizations work together across sectors, and the way that different charities and NGOs with particular remits will all kind of collaborate together and work within this particular arts and health space. So the Re-emerge project that was developed very much in partnership with healthcare organizations, with healthcare practitioners, with community charities. Now, the Re-emerge project had a very specific aim, and that was to support, I mean, as you can tell with the name Re-emerge, it was about this kind of re-emergence after the pandemic. It was about recovery from COVID, not just in a physical sense, but in a community sense. And it was particularly looking at how particular communities were really affected by isolation during the pandemic. And one of the groups that they were working to support were mothers and birthing parents and kind of families with babies and young children who had a particularly challenging experience during the pandemic, with obviously isolation, with the idea of the village that you have around you when you have a baby not being there because we were restricted from going into people's houses. Sometimes mothers would have given birth without their partners there if it was in the height of the pandemic. Playgroups closed. Lots of changes and lots of things not as anticipated perhaps before the pandemic. And the impact that had on this community was enormous. So the number of referrals for mental health care for women and birthing parents in the perinatal period were rocketed in terms of the demand for help and support, which it's very clear why that was the case and what impact this would have had. So one of the strands in this project relates to supporting mothers and supporting mothers with babies. I'm just going to stop for a second and have a drink of water. So that project led to lots of other projects as well. And the work I'm presenting today in this webinar, it's actually lots of different projects. There's kind of one intellectual project for me in terms of this work and looking at what happens in creative context and what are people doing. And for the practitioners I'm working with, we really collaborate across multiple funding streams, thinking about different ways to continue this work and thinking about questions that arise in one project that we might want to explore in another project. So there's quite a lot of people involved in this work, and I will have an acknowledgement slide at the end to try and capture some of this. But I want to kind of make this transparent because this isn't a large kind of £1 million project. This is lots and lots of different projects that all have something in common and that all keep this work moving forward. So perhaps the arts organisation will well, they do apply for different strands of funding. Perhaps I will apply for funding that's research that also encompasses the arts organisation. So it kind of moves and progresses through these multiple intersecting pieces of work. And this has included a project that I led in 2023, so 2 years ago, which again involved the arts organisation working with a small charity whose focus was on adoptive families. And we did some work around what interdisciplinary creative practice can do to support adoptive parents with well-being. For example, I was involved in an Arts Council England funded podcast project, which involved the Maternal Journal founder and different artists and creative practitioners. And we had a podcast series and we had workshops which related to the podcast series. There have been other projects around creative health. And we've also done things like co-curated exhibitions. We've had student researchers work on different things. So kind of all this work in this big kind of entanglement. And this is what keeps the work going, but also this is what makes it exciting in terms of what things can be and how we see this work progressing and developing in the future. But to give you a sense of the context for the arts, so this work is about long-term collaborations. It's about commitments to working together. It's about understanding what different people need out of a project and a collaboration. But the context is not, it's a little bit bleak. The arts are under huge pressure, but also they have huge potential to transform lives, society, and the economy for the better. But the UK has got one of the lowest levels of government spending on culture among European nations, and was one of a small minority of countries to reduce total culture spending per person between 2010 and 2022. So, and that's from a recent report called The State of the Arts, which is about the arts sector in the country at the moment. So this gives you a glimpse, a small sense of what arts organisations are the pressures they're under, and how this kind of fragmented, kind of multi-project process works. But to move forward to talk about Maternal Journal, so one of the strands of this work was to support mothers and birthing parents. There's lots of different creative programmes, both within the UK but also internationally, which relate to mothering, art and creativity. Lots of books being written and articles being written about mothering, about motherhood, and about art and creativity. So just as a Maternal Journal is one example of this, and it's a global community movement. But there's other examples too. There's things like Mothers Who Make, the Creative Mothers Project. Now, Maternal Journal was founded by a midwife, artist and producer, as one person, in 2017. And she is called Laura Godfrey Isaacs, and she was responding to what she was observing in her practice as a midwife. So she saw that there was a real gap for women and birthing parents who'd experienced particular challenges, but weren't necessarily ticking all the boxes where they would be provided with support. So the kind of general worry and anxiety, the huge change that having a baby can bring, and the kind of unexpected. And there's an idea of what having a baby might be like, and then what it actually is like, and the big kind of gap between these. So she developed a program which she called Maternal Journal, which was kind of based on her experience as an artist as well, where she set up creative journaling. And that the idea was around boosting well-being, thinking about mental health, thinking about connection, thinking about community, thinking about bringing people together, but really about these ideas of well-being, and how this work could potentially make an impact. And it's in pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. And she has developed lots of different working with a community around her, so working with different people, working with artists and creative practitioners, applied for lots of funding to create prompts and tools, to create materials based on artists' work, create again the things like the podcast series I mentioned. And so Maternal Journal has grown as this kind of broader movement, and people can train to be Maternal Journal practitioners, and then they can run groups themselves There are lots of different resources. I've put a link on the slide to the website, but and I'm very happy to share my slides if anyone wants me to send them to them, so you can find all the links on the slides. But there's a book, there's web resources, there's training for practitioners, there's an online community, there's very active people on Instagram. So it very much is at local level. Yes, there'll be a program where people can attend on a weekly basis, but there's also this global community. It connects very much from the local to the global. How this works in West Yorkshire, so how this works in the research I've been doing is within all these different projects, there are multiple locations. There are sorry, I was just checking that the chat didn't say I needed to end. Okay, so lots of different locations. They've expanded this work across different places. So in the arts organisation itself, they have a space for this, but also in community centres, in prisons, in hospitals, in the neonatal suite, at the local maternity hospital, in family hubs. People delivering maternal journal are trained practitioners from diverse contexts, quite a lot of perinatal mental health midwives, including one who first kind of introduced it to the arts organisation, who's been leading on kind of maternal health and well-being across the region. There's strong partnership with the NHS, with community organisations as well, with we call them family hubs, and they're basically centres where families can get support, families with young children, school associated centres as well. So it's really kind of grown and bloomed over the last 3.5 years. There tends to be a kind of set limit on the course, so it's either 8 weeks or 10 weeks. Sometimes it's 6 weeks. People will come together weekly. There'll be maybe about 8 people in a group, 8 to 10 mothers. It's 1 hour 45. It's just under 2 hours. And during that period of time, there's a crash as well. So childcare workers are employed to look after the babies and the children. So instead of it being like a play group where the focus is really the baby or the child, or the mother and the child, but rarely the mother themselves. This is basically about the mother. So this is about the mother having support and having this space for creativity and to meet people and to share experiences. And obviously the people who deliver this work are trained in terms of signposting and support, and how to kind of support these women going forward and outside the group as well. So how am I researching this? Well, creative inquiry, we're conceptualizing in different ways, and I kind of want to start with creative inquiry because I think it gives a good sense of an orientation for working in this kind of context that's actually very it changes. It's not kind of every group, every session, all the people involved. It's very unpredictable. It grows. It's very collaborative. So an orientation to researching this needs to be quite open to this change and this kind of development. So we're using this idea of creative inquiry as being research with, into and through the arts as a kind of starting point. And with Lou Harvey, who's at the University of Leeds, we've been kind of exploring and dissecting this notion of creative inquiry, but we wanted to try and find a way of defining and naming this kind of work that often takes place in the margins. This kind of research that is very iterative and it grows, and it's with practitioners, with artists, and with the arts, but has a kind of language dimension as well. And we use this word this term creative inquiry. We used it tentatively, we used it critically, and we wanted to try and describe research which brings in the arts, broadly defined, or creative methods in some way. So we started with this idea of trying to categorize it, and as with any kind of categorization, you start with a categorization, and then you realize that actually this is only ever very partial. It's only ever a starting point. But we were thinking about this in terms of research with the arts, research into the arts, and research through the arts. And again, we're constantly critiquing this even these categories themselves, but it provided a good starting point at that time. But what this actually means in practice is quite complicated. So with this work, I decided I would try and list all the different methods and approaches that I'm using in this work. I would say it's broadly ethnographic, but also has autoethnographic elements, as I'm going to show you. It's arts-based, so there's creative elements. Even the methods of data generation that I'm using have some arts-based dimensions. I participate in groups as much as I can. So I tried, especially earlier on in the project, to spend a lot of time in a group, with a group, participant observation, you might call it, or hanging out. So working with practitioners, being there, having meetings, chatting. There's also more kind of social science methods, including questionnaires for practitioners, questionnaires for participants, interviews. I've done some interviews over the past 3.5 years as well with either participants or with stakeholders, different kinds of stakeholders, different practitioners, focus groups. Something we've called the one word, which is where at the start of a workshop we've been trying to explore ways of capturing what happens in a particular space of time. So what happens across a 2-hour workshop. And we use something which is very simple, called the one word, where we ask everyone who participates to write down one word at the start and then one word at the end. And then we've looked at that in terms of how people are perceiving what happens in a group, what people feel like before and what they feel like after. And actually, for something so simple, that's given us some quite incredibly powerful data about this particular process and what happens, and obviously then supported by the ethnographic observational notes, the field notes, the artworks, the photographs, the images, also practitioner diaries we've been experimenting with in different ways, with co-curation, so working with participants to curate exhibitions, to produce artworks such as zines. So you can see the image on the slide here. It's from the zine that we produced together. And I've also done a global survey of practitioners, trying to get a sense of what practitioners are doing across all the different countries that this takes place in. Because something that's interesting about a movement is it was very much set up in a kind of non-controlling way. So Laura Godfrey Isaacs, who established it, there are principles involved in it, but essentially once people have done the training, they can just go and run with it and do what they do their work without kind of any sort of registration. But what this meant was we didn't really have a sense of what's happening out there. So I've done a survey, which I did last year, to actually get some sense of the diversity of practice that's happening globally. Some elements of this are participatory, some are co-produced, not all, but it's very iterative and it's very much based on working very closely with the practitioners and also with participants. There's a film there, which I'm not going to show you, but I will happily share it with you. So one of the things we did as well, we made a film last year. And here's just some examples. Again, these are taken from the zine of the artworks that participants produce in maternal journals. So some of the things they do. So there's a collective prompt, which everyone works on together. And then at the end of the session, people discuss what they've created and why and what things mean to them. And this is just an example here. This is one of the activities, which is about your hand. So your amazing hand and what your hand does in the day. And you can see some of the words that have been written on this hand. And it's this coming back to this idea of the everyday. So you've got the cooking, the drawing, typing, cleaning, washing, stroking, patting, driving, hairbrushing, wiping. Again, the kind of repetitive things that mothers and birthing parents are doing. And then this is a diagram that we made with some of the participants about what maternal journal means and the different kind of aspects of maternal journal according to participants. And this is the same group of participants actually who co-curated an exhibition and made the zine with us. So just a point of reflection, my role in the project is one of privilege and I don't take it lightly. I'm not responsible for the design or the delivery of the workshops, although I have done the training to deliver multiple times. I was invited to participate in this everydayness and to contribute to its exploration and to its sharing. And within this, I had to work out how I might engage with these different everydays, with this everydayness, and in this invited and privileged space, doing whatever justice I could to these fragments and slices, while also recognizing the need for the emergent space created through the creative activities to remain one that was private and safe for everyone participating. And that's an important point because the data I'm going to show you is actually from my own participant observation, so from my own journaling within the group. So I start off here. I'm going to show you some of the data now. So starting off, this is an example of some of my field notes and some of what I'm writing about that session. So I am aware of that. I think I haven't got a huge amount of time, so I won't read all of this out, but you can see what I'm trying to grasp in terms of what's happening in that particular maternal journal session and how it's structured and what we're doing and what that space looks like. From a methodological perspective, I don't write these notes in the session because I'm doing as much as I can not to disrupt the session. Obviously, the practitioners and the participants all know what I'm doing. We've done all the necessary ethical documentation and processes, but I wouldn't want to sit there and write because that would disrupt that space. So everything I'm writing, I'm either recording afterwards on my voice notes on my phone and then transcribing, or I'm writing it afterwards. So the task in the session that I'm looking at, I can see there's a message in the chat now. Is that 5 minutes left? Oh, okay. Thanks, Claudia. So the task for the day that I'm focusing on now is dandelions, and it's been designed by the co-producer of the movement. It's framed as putting the day's complications down on paper and breaking them into smaller pieces can help them feel more achievable overall. The activity is categorized as drawing, painting. It requires pencils, paints, and pens. The creator tells a story of how she created the activity to respond to the feeling of being pulled in all directions. There are 2 steps. Try to focus on the little things getting in the way today and make a note of them. Draw or paint a dandelion clock in your journal using any pens or materials that you like. You can make it super detailed or keep it simple. So this is an example of what I made. This is my artwork that I made in this session, and you can see, I don't know if you can see very clearly, but there's different words dotted across it, and then there's the paintings themselves of the dandelions. So I've written paper, conference, traveling, funding, car, bedding, deadlines, emails, writing. So the journal page says something of the process that I've started with a pencil. I've sketched out dandelion shapes onto the page with clocks and flying seeds. For each of the seeds flying away from the clocks, I've written words which represent the things I have to do, the things getting in the way. And these words offer glimpses of my academic and family life, entangling with the research. Looking back at this page, as I write now, 11 months later, I noticed that I've captured the ephemera of that moment. My eldest daughter had recently sprained her ankle. Meanwhile, so much of what I've noted would be what I'd also note today if I were to do this exercise again. So thinking about time, space, the mundane, everyday moments suspended. And then moving on to that which was shared. That which is shared. I can't remember the exact details of the paper, the funding, or the conference I mentioned. But if we go back to look at the painting itself, I've painted washes of light blue watercolour over the background, and I've added cloudy white, green and yellow to the dandelion clocks. Within the workshop space, I notice how I soak in and draw on the methods and approaches of the other participants, the motifs, and later in the workshop, when we share what we've created, we note common themes of the day-to-day, articulating the mundanity and everyday practices which propel lives along, but also in the practices themselves and the way that we kind of learning from each other about how we're creating the artworks in our journals. So the methods and approaches leak across pages, ways of working are shared, not just experiences. So to finish up, journaling everydayness. So an approach to journaling is an approach to everydayness, which is to engaging with everydayness, which is political at its core. So journaling groups as one option on the motherhood smorgasbord are entanglements into which people are knotted once they take on this mother identity. But they're also a space where the mother identity is shaped, pulled apart, reformed, collectively imagined and reimagined. And Godfrey Isaacs talks about this. She says, journaling in pregnancy has a particular poignancy as it relates to the inevitable marking of time the nature of the experience as a journey, and the sense of being in the liminal space. Moving to think about this in terms of the transpersonnel, it's this idea of bridging the individual and the collective and accounting for the simultaneous embodiedness and sharedness of experience. So the creative and journaling programs provide mothers with a space to explore their experiences and their feelings, to explore individual everydayness in a collective space, and to collectively produce the everyday. So for a short period of time, these workshops become entangled in women's everydays. They become a marker of time, of day, of routine. And as markers, they entangle with other markers. So they entangle with other everyday things like the baby weigh-in, the health checkpoints, the weaning, the longer periods of sleep. And these all come up in these conversations and in these artworks within these journaling workshops. Connecting back to translanguaging and going back to the kind of one of the ways of exploring translanguaging that I mentioned earlier, this idea of biographies, histories, and linguistic backgrounds, you can see that an individual repertoire is shaped by all these others, but it's also marked by human experiences and human events. And what journaling is doing is materializing these. So also it's creating new human experiences and human events. So to finish up, the individual is entangled with the collective. The collective brings the individual to the fore, acknowledging and recognizing experiences, ideas, shared experiences, everydayness, artistic methods, ways of creating, and travel all become materialized. And what can be taken from this is actually, so it's in this act, this collective and creative reflection on the everyday that makes it material, that brings it into being. And it's within this act that the individual and the collective collide. And then I've got the methodological point here. So something I want us to think about as researchers is how we attend to these things within the space in which we're privileged to be invited, and how we might treat the everydayness of the worlds in which we now also playing a part in creating through our research. To finish up, here's some ideas that I'm working on at the moment of future research. So the research carries on. We've got a funded project for another couple of years with the arts organisation. My global practitioner survey, I'm hoping to write that up in the coming months, looking at arts-based approaches to practitioner identities, because something that's become very interesting in the data is around how practitioners perceive this work, and particularly in terms of intercultural communication in journaling with refugee groups, for example, and new arrivals. So I'm going to finish there because I think I'm probably slightly over time, but wanted to just say, here are my acknowledgements, because none of this work happens just by me. This all happens with lots of different people who are just incredible to work with, and very, very passionate and motivated for the work that they do. So my acknowledgements are here. And I have my references here as well, which as I've said, I'm very happy to share these slides with anyone who'd be interested. Thank you.